Disclaimer: while I am calling this video a review, it is more of a thought piece that assumes knowledge of the original Dragon's Dogma game and is meant to promote discussion. This review is my opinion. That means it is somewhat subjective. While there are some objective differences between the Dragon's Dogma games, your enjoyment of them is subjective. With regards to bugs and performance issues, I think most people know about them. Vermund is notoriously bad, and 99% of my game crashes happen in Vermund. However, most games nowadays have been released with issues. This is not a great situation for the game industry, and is not customer friendly. But I'm not going to list the performance issues on release as something that makes Dragon's Dogma 2 a particularly bad release. What's annoying about Dragon's Dogma 2 at the time of this review is that Vermund's performance still hasn't been fixed 2 months after release. The story is worse than Dragon's Dogma 1. The world is not explained as well, and sometimes it seems like they expect you to have played Dragon's Dogma 1. Since I've spent over 900 hours playing Dragon's Dogma 1, this wasn't an issue for me, but I definitely relied on my understanding of Dragon's Dogma 1's story to get a foothold in understanding Dragon's Dogma's 2 story. Dragon Dogma's 1 story was better contained. The main story up to the fight with Grigory was fairly basic. Dragon emerges, bringing monsters who terrorize the country. Hero arises and gains support. The hero then slays the dragon. There are other plotlines that add flavor to the story, such as the Duke's jealousy of the Arisen and the Cult of Salvation, but the main plot is fairly simple. Additionally, the subplot of the Duke's jealousy is tied into the main plot very well, with him being a former Arisen who sacrificed his pawn out of fear. Mechanics like pawns not being able to enter the castle are explained by this story device. Overall, a smaller game with a shorter story, but much better written. The main plot points are fairly easy to grasp the first time you play it, and there's more for you to catch on a second playthrough. Dragon Dogma's 2 story left me feeling unsatisfied. The main plot arc is kind of similar at its most basic level, but there are plot complications without any resolution. Again, dragon attacks the country, hero arises and is chosen by the dragon, the hero slays the dragon and becomes ruler. However, the Vernwood story does not really reach any satisfying conclusion. The Arisen does quests to undermine the Queen Regent and gain support, but the coronation quest is very anticlimactic. No one is involved except Brant, the Arisen, and the pawns, and it's basically just a short cutscene and off to Batal we go. I would have hoped with all the quests we did, we should have had more popular support and more characters would be involved in the coronation quest. Additionally, this queen is positioned as our main rival to the throne, but she retains power the entire playthrough, and even when you're crowned sovereign, you don't hear anything about what happens to her. The second part of the story, in Batal, is rather uninteresting. I remember Brant and Ulrika much more than I do any of the Batal characters. The time spent in Batal also seemed much shorter in terms of character interactions. The main noble researcher was a much less compelling villain than the head of Salvation from the original game, who was a complete fanatic. We don't really see the main researcher much, whereas we met the head of Salvation multiple times throughout the Dragon One's Dogma story, and that set him up for the final scene where he's finally killed by Grigory. We know who he is, and we actually have some kind of emotional feelings towards him. The quests were less interesting than the original game's quests. I remember the siege of the Shadow Fort and the Griffin Hunt being particularly memorable from the first game. Going through tunnels to open a gate to let in an army, and then fighting your way to the boss was a rather unique experience. There was no similar experience in Dragon's Dogma 2. The Risen never fights with the backing of the rulers. The Risen was always going solo with pawns. The Griffin hunt was also fun because you go with a squad to hunt the Griffin who gets away, and then you hunt the Griffin down to its lair and finish it. I personally went to Griffin Nest in Dragon's Dogma 2 to kill the Griffins, but that was because I had a personal vendetta against them. It would have been much cooler if there had been an actual mission to kill the Griffin and hunt it down to its nest. Finally, the final dragon fight against Gregory was much less epic than in the first Dragon's Dogma. In the first game, Gregory is actively trying to delete you as soon as you choose to fight him. He attacks you while you're trying to cross bridges, and eventually you jump on his back and try to stab his heart while he's flying, at which point he shakes you off. You go through a cutscene where you're trying to dodge being bit in half in midair, and then you land in the arena where you conclude the battle. In the new game, Gregory invites you onto his back so that he can fly you to the arena, and then the boss battle is very much a copy paste of the boss battle from the first game. It was much less memorable. In terms of gameplay, Dragon's Dogma 2 is a step forward in some ways and a step back in others. Every class gets 5 skills, 1 class skill, and 4 optional skills. This is a downgrade for every class except the warrior, who only was allowed 3 skills in the original game. Overall, it seemed to me like the combat borrowed a lot from Monster Hunter World in terms of climbing and debilitations, as well as cooking food. I like this feature of Dragon's Dogma, since it's the only game that has this kind of fight against mythical creatures, and it's what attracted me to the first one and keeps me playing the series. Alright, now I'm going to discuss classes. As a short disclaimer, I did the vast majority of my playthrough with only my pawn, who was a mage the whole time. So, my viewpoint is not from the perspective of someone who used a full squad the whole game. The fighter is very similar to the class in the original game. Block is the same button, so the class has 2 less available skills than originally. The class maintains the same strengths and weaknesses. Strong in melee, weak at ranged. The mage is similar, again, to the original game. The main heal is now the class skill, leaving 4 slots to go offensively or defensively. I set my pawn as a mage for the whole game and gave her a full offensive setup. And this worked pretty well, especially when I was playing the trick heal. The main downside with the class skill heal is that it's centered on the caster, so that if you're playing a tank, the mage has to walk into melee to heal. Now, there is an optional slot for a ranged heal, but then you're losing 2 skills to heals, which seems unnecessary in my opinion. Now, we introduced the new classes from Dragon's Dogma 2, which are the Thief Vocation, which is focused on dagger abilities, and it corresponds very closely to the Strider Vocation from the original game, but you lose all the ranged bow abilities. It also takes a few skills from the Assassin and the Magic Archer class from the original. I think this is the strongest class in the game, and the Meister skill is an auto dodge, which does not really cost that much stamina to maintain. So you have basically perma invincibility, while having some access to fire damage. And the best weapons for the class have innate holy damage. The second new class is the Archer class, which is basically taken from the Ranger class from the original game, but you lose all of the dagger abilities. I found that losing all of the melee abilities was very irritating, since a lot of the enemies have pretty long range gap closers, which makes it very easy for the archer to get swarmed, and if you're staggered, it's very hard for you to get your damage out as the archer. Then we go back to the sorcerer, which is fairly similar to the original game, but I would say buffed The cast times are shortened, and now you have a self-peel ability with a lightning mine ability. You lose the Holy Focus Bolt, which was kind of the bread and butter ability from the first game, but the Meteor spell is much stronger, and all of the meteors are targeted on the enemy, especially if they're large, which means that you can now take out Shimura with one or two casts. And the new thing was that it does a lot of physical damage, so it can take out a normal golem in two casts of the meteor ability, which is a huge buff for the sorcerer because previously the golem was basically invincible to even a high level sorcerer. Next class I'm going to discuss is the warrior, which has very similar skills to the original game. However, it gets an additional 2 skills since now it has access to 5 skills instead of 3. I think this is an overall buff. However, as a tank, I think it's slightly nerfed because you can't heal back max health using food, meaning you really have to camp, and there's no way to heal back max health in the middle of a fight, which does hurt its tanking abilities. The Mystic Spearhand class basically replaces the Magic Knight from the original. It doesn't have the same feel of gameplay because it's more offensive, there's no shield. However, it's got very strong abilities, and it does have a shield which has short duration but takes a lot of damage, so you basically can be permanently invisible with the Mystic Spearhand. The Magic Archer class felt a lot more clunky to play than in the first game. It seemed to me like the abilities took longer to charge and were harder to target with, and again, it has no self-peel like the Archer class. The Trickster vocation is fun to play around with, and I think it can be quite strong in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing. But it felt that it was the most hurt by having a limited number of skills. If I could have access to 6 or 7 skills, I think the class would have felt a lot better to play. The final class is the Warfarer, which is, in my opinion, a good idea that was implemented poorly. You only have access to 4 skill slots. The class slot is whatever weapon you're holding. And then one of those 4 optional skill slots is taken up by the weapon switching ability. There is no reason to equip more than 3 weapons, and you're probably going to be more effective if you focus on 2 or just 1 weapon, at which point it's better just to use the specialized class instead of the Warfare class. I would have preferred if the class ability for the Warfare was the weapon swap, and then each skill loadout would have corresponded to the weapon, so you would swap skills whenever you swapped weapons, and that would have made the class much stronger and potentially could have broken the game in some ways, but I don't think that's an issue in a single player game, especially when if you're high level, the game's extremely easy. Anyway, I would say the only reason to use the Warfare is for Fashion Dogma, since you can use any armor and weapon combo with the class. Monsters. The roster of monsters is very similar. The Minotaur, Sphinx, Medusa, and Dullahan, and the Slime are the new monsters. The rest are variations of goblins, harpians, and saurians from the original game, and you have the Griffin and the Cyclops and the dragons are all from the original. They dropped the cockroaches from the old game, and they also took the Elder Ogre and the Garm from Bitter Black Isle. And that's about all the change. You obviously don't have access to Death or Daimon, because those were very tied to Bitter Black Isle's lore, and I don't think you would be able to port them into a new game in any kind of reasonable way. Of the new enemies, I found Dullahan to be the most annoying with any class other than Thief, and the slime to be the most distinct. I remember my first encounter with a slime where I was a fighter, fully melee physical damage, and I was unable to hurt it, and I was sucked in and it drained all my stamina and killed me very quickly. And I remember thinking, this is the first game I've played where they actually make slime enemies frightening. In most games, slimes are easy enemies who you fight at low level. Here, they are mostly current caves and can kill you pretty quickly if your first time fighting them. They're fairly easy to learn that they're very weak to magic, so they are not a tough enemy to fight, but they are a unique way to do slimes, in my opinion. For exploration, the game felt worse to explore than Elden Ring and Skyrim, which I consider to be some of the better open world exploration games, especially for medieval fantasy. And I think they really nailed exploration in two ways. But the reason I think that Dragon's Dogma 2 did not do exploration well is that the enemies are crowded very heavily on top of each other. Sometimes enemies kind of faded, came in when I was in the middle of a fight. This did not matter at high level because they were all easy, but at low level, this could result in my death. And I found that very irritating early on. And they're crowded on top of each other so much that it starts feeling like wave-based combat simulator instead of like an actual exploration game. Both Skyrim and Elden Ring spaced enemies much better so that you could avoid them fairly easily. And you could actually just be like exploring someplace and not be constantly fighting your way to explore that area. Like if you wanted to climb a mountain in Skyrim, you would meet an occasional enemy, but you aren't constantly fighting. Same for Elden Ring. They also have mounts, which means traveling around is much easier. The second thing that both Skyrim and Elden Ring did well, that I remember, is that they always gave you unique weapons or armor at the end of dungeons. I never found something in a dungeon in Dragon's Dogma 2 that I couldn't buy at a shop, and the rewards often didn't feel worth exploring the cave. I think one way they could have rewarded exploring caves would it be if they drastically reduced the number of Seekers tokens and put one at every statue so that you would have a reason to find a way up to statues, and at the end of every dungeon. And then you have a real reason to explore dungeons and get to landmarks. And that would be to unlock the equipment. And then you could drastically reduce the number of Seekers tokens so that you didn't have to find 220 or whatever to fully unlock all that gear, which just takes a long time and it's very grindy in a game that I don't think needs to have that kind of grind. I think you should have a reason to explore other than finding 240 of some random item. My final objection to exploration is that you only have 12 days to explore the unmoored world. It's the only real end game that the game has, and you can only play in it for 12 days. You really don't want to sleep at inns. It should mostly be camping, and you feel rushed the entire time you're in the unmoored world. I don't know who made the decision to make it only last for 12 days, but in my opinion, it was a bad decision. So, in conclusion, Dragon's Dogma 2 feels very similar to Dragon's Dogma 1 in a lot of ways, but the map is noticeably bigger. I don't think it was really worth a $70 price tag when the original you can get for about $10 when it's on sale. I think a $50 to $60 price tag would have been much more reasonable for what the game gives you. It doesn't innovate on anything that was in the first game in a noticeable way, and the quests were less memorable in general. I Didn't really discuss the cash shop in my review, but it offers nothing that I would be willing to buy, and does not seem like any effort was put into the monetization scheme. That's both good and bad. It's good because I'm not tempted to buy anything in the cash shop, but it's bad because it reflects the lack of thought that the game suffers from in general. I've put 140 hours into the game, and I'm likely to keep playing the game and unlock all the achievements. But that's because I love the first game, and the second game feels very similar. If you're on the fence in buying the game, I would recommend considering how much you like the first game. If you love the first game, you'll probably like this one. If you haven't played the first one, I would recommend buying it and trying it out because it's very similar while being much cheaper. It's also much better optimized and has no problems for um, your computer. If you have an old computer, you'll probably be able to run the first game. Well, thank you for listening, and that is my Dragon's Dogma 2 review in relation to Dragon's Dogma 1.